Okay, welcome to Come Follow Me for the Old Testament. Today we're covering Genesis 37 to 41. This is a very familiar story for most people. It entails Jacob and his sons. In particular, it focuses on Joseph. Joseph was known to be a favorite of Jacob's, and this caused a certain amount of jealousy among all of the other children. I think this was fueled in part by Joseph's personality, by Joseph not realizing the effect that he was having on his brothers. If you look at verse 2 here, it talks about Joseph being 17 years old. And the last part of verse 2 says, Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. He was telling his dad the things that his brothers were doing. And this caused a huge amount of animosity between them. In verse 3 here, we find that Joseph receives a special coat from his father because he's well beloved. It's described as a coat of many colors. This is not exactly as it appears, is described like that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. But the Hebrew itself indicates that it's merely a long coat with sleeves, an embroidered coat, a nice coat, but not necessarily of many colors as we have come to know in the stories. Verse 4 indicates that the brothers could not speak peaceably unto him. There was certainly a giant animosity that had grown between them. This is further inflamed when Joseph begins to tell them of the dreams that he's had. He says here he's dreamed a dream. He talks about the sheaves of wheat who bow down to him. Another dream about the stars who acknowledge him as a leader. And as he tells his brothers and his father these different dreams that he's dreamed, the boys envy him, but the father, who's obviously wiser and older, observes the sayings and just kind of doesn't make a comment about them. So Joseph is sent to check on his brothers to see what they're doing. And when he goes to the area where they were last reported, he meets a certain man. That's all he's described as, which is a little bit strange, but it kind of moves the story along. It represents to this population and to the people who are familiar with this type of storytelling that the presence of the Lord is there to change the direction or the course of Joseph's life. And so he is told where to find his brothers. From Dieter F. Uchtdorf, we have the following. Following the Savior will not remove all of your trials. However, it will remove the barriers between you and the help your Heavenly Father wants to give you. God will be with you. And so God is certainly present in our lives, but he doesn't necessarily remove all of our trials. He just simply helps us to understand what he wants us to do. So as he approaches his brothers, they see him coming from afar off, and they conspire against him. And they say such things as, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Some of them want to kill him. Others talk about casting him into a pit. When Reuben hears it, he's not very happy, and he tries to make a plan to stop the killing of Joseph. Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, is what he suggests to them. And that's exactly what they do. They throw him into the pit, then they strip off his coat, and they see a band of Ishmaelites coming who are traitors. And this is where the story gets a little bit confusing, because Judah says, what profit is it to us if we kill him? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. And then it describes them as Midianites and also Ishmaelites, and that they sell him for 20 pieces of silver. Now, Midianites are relatives. That would be through the sons of Abraham and Keturah. And the Ishmaelites are also kind of cousins. That would be through the son of Abraham and Hagar. We're not really sure here. Were they Midianites? Were they Ishmaelites? It's a little bit confusing, particularly when you get into Genesis 37. It talks about Midianites who sell them to Potiphar. But in Genesis 39, it talks about Ishmaelites. And so who was it? And then later, even in Genesis 40 and 45, when Joseph's describing what happened to him, first he said he was stolen away or kidnapped, and then he says he's sold. So again, there's a bit of confusion here. From Professor Gary A. Rensburg, where he says, I prefer the literary explanation. The confusion reflects the confusion in Joseph's mind. The reader experiences the events as Joseph experienced them. Stuck at the bottom of it. Joseph is able to hear only muffled sounds and dialogue from above. He's pulled out and transported to Egypt, but because he himself is unsure about what happened, the narration presents the tale in very confused terms. Confused language also appears in Genesis 37, where Reuben, upon discovering that the pit is empty, when Joseph is not in sight, states in the Hebrew, and I, where am I to come? This confused language reflects the confusion in Reuben's mind, which is unable to produce even clear syntax. This represents yet another literary device in the arsenal of the ancient Israelite writers. Joseph is sold for 20 pieces of silver, and from Leviticus we learn that this is approximately how much is paid for a slave between the ages of 5 to 20. And if he was an adult slave, it would have been 30 shekels or 30 pieces of silver. And that's exactly what Jesus is sold for, which is the price of a slave, an adult slave. When Reuben returns and he finds Joseph's no longer in the pit, tears his clothing, he's upset. Then the brothers as a group take Joseph's coat and dip it in the blood of a small goat that is killed. Then they take his coat, which was given to him by Jacob, back to his father with this fabricated evidence, and they let Jacob assume that Joseph's been killed. They don't actually tell him that, they just show him the fabricated evidence. And then we move into chapter 38, which is a story about Judah, and it compares to chapters 39 and beyond, which is a story about Joseph. And the story of Judah really is a representation of his resentment that he has and his wickedness, his unrighteousness. And it contrasts with Joseph, who had every reason to be resentful of what happened to him, but of his righteousness. And this is very much like what we find in the Book of Mormon, where the Book of Mormon will show two consecutive chapters with somebody acting in righteousness and another person acting in wickedness. So in chapter 38, Judah marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. We're told in verse 7 that his oldest boy was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him or allowed him to be killed. And so then, according to Jewish law, they create a Levirate marriage. This is where Er's wife, who has not had any children, named Tamar, is then given to the second son in order that he can raise up a righteous posterity. The second son is very reluctant to do this, and he does wickedness before the Lord that displeases him, and he is also slain. So then Judah promises to give Tamar as a wife to his third son, but his third son is not old enough, and so she has to wait. And then when he does become old enough, Judah does not fulfill this promise. So Tamar kind of takes things into her own hands in order to rectify this situation. Now, there are a lot of assumptions that go on here in Genesis 38, where Tamar changes out of her widow's garment, covers herself with a veil, finds out where Judah is going to be, and then places herself on the road. And because she's veiled her face, when Judah goes by, he assumes that she is a harlot. So he requests her services. He promises to pay her with a small goat, but he doesn't have that with him. And so she requires some collateral for him, and he gives her his signet ring, the bracelets that he's wearing, and the staff that's in his hand. And then he goes in and she services him. At the end of this situation, she arises and takes off her veil, puts back on her garments of widowhood, and then goes and leads on a normal life. But Judah sends his friend to pay for the services that have been rendered. And when he gets there, he finds that there is no harlot. There never was a harlot. And so when he returns to Judah, they're very, very perplexed at what just happened. As time goes on, Tamar is pregnant and she begins to show. They drag her in front of Judah, who says that she should be killed, that she should be burnt as a result of her wickedness. But Tamar, representing herself, says, I am with child, and this is the person who is the father, and she produces then the signet ring, the bracelets, and the staff. So Judah realizes that he's been backed into a corner here, and that he acknowledges that they're his, and that she has in fact been more righteous than him. And he says this for 4 different reasons. Number one, he didn't keep his oath that he had given to Tamar to allow her to have children by the brothers. And then he also gave into temptation, having seen her on the side of the road. He's very self-righteous in his judgment, inasmuch as he judges her for being with child, but obviously he's the father, and so it was his act that precipitated this. And then he's very humiliated when this sin is exposed. So then you have to ask yourself, why is this story about Judah in the middle of the story of Joseph? And if you look further into it, when you look at Judah, who was the one who decided that he should trick his father and sell his brother into slavery in Egypt, the wording here is very, very similar. He was the ringleader behind proposing this plan. And if you look at the wording in verse 32, it says, "This have we found, know now whether it be thy son's coat or not." And these are almost exactly the same words that Tamara uses on him when she says, "Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet, the bracelet, and the staff." So it's very fitting that Judah would be deceived in a very similar manner that he caused the deception upon his father. Again, from the good professor, once more it is a low-ranking woman in the story who serves as a heroine. Note that Tamar is a non-Israelite who plays the role of a prostitute, that is, a woman on the margins of society, one of the truly lowly. Yet she is one who takes the moral high ground because she has been wronged by Judah. She represents Israel, which lacks the might of other nations, but can gain and prosper by using its wit and morality. When you look at Tamar, she is a very unlikely heroine who uses whatever is available to her, the means that are available to her, to remove the stain of being without child, which was not her fault. It's a little bit difficult for us to understand this concept, but we can in fact understand that the Lord blesses her for trying to do what is right. And in fact, the scriptures are very interesting because they point out that Jesus Christ and King David actually come through Tamar's line. And so this is really telling about how the Hebrews actually felt about her, that she was indeed a very blessed woman. We then move back to the story about Joseph, and we're into chapter 39. So Joseph is brought down to Egypt, and he is sold to Potiphar, who is an officer, a captain of the guard in the Egyptian hierarchy. From the Old Testament Institute Manual, we learned that the Hebrew phrase, which is translated as a captain of the guards, literally means chief of the butchers or slaughterers. From this meaning, some scholars have thought that he was the chief cook or steward in the house of Pharaoh, but others believe that the butcher or slaughterer is used in the sense of an executioner, and thus Potiphar was the commanding officer of the royal bodyguard who executed the capital sentences ordered by the king. Either way, Potiphar was a very important man, and the latter position especially would give him great power and status in Egypt. Another thought here, another point of view here, where they take this word officer and they look at the original Hebrew, saris, and it comes from an unused root word meaning to castrate. And so by implication, they think that Potiphar was a eunuch, thus a minister of state. So this alternate view might help us understand Potiphar's wife's behavior later in the story. So we find out that the Lord is with Joseph, and he causes the house of Potiphar to prosper quite a lot, that the Lord is with him. And in this respect, he's very similar to Jacob, who with Laban was able to take Laban's flocks from a very few and prosper Laban and cause a huge increase in his wealth. So we have a similarity in this respect between Joseph and Jacob. We also find out that Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. This is almost identical to the words that were used for Rachel, who is considered very, very beautiful. And so we see that he's very like his mother in appearance, but very like his father in how he is blessed. Then we get into the story of Potiphar's wife, which is also very famous. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, lie with me. Joseph is very uncommonly handsome, and she wants him, but he refuses, and he says, and I'm going to switch over from the King James Version, which is on the right side, to the NIV, because it's a little easier to understand. And he says, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. Switching back now to the King James Version, verse 9, there is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So we have these two stories juxtapositioned. Judah, who does basically everything wrong, and Joseph, despite all the temptation that's thrown at him, he refuses and he stays true to his covenants. Verse 10, we find out that Potiphar's wife is after Joseph every day. She's just unrelenting that she wants him. Then she waits in verse 11 till no one else is around. And then in verse 12, she pushes it further by catching his garment to force Joseph to lie with her. Joseph, of course, refuses and he flees, leaving his garment behind. In verse 14, we see that having been frustrated, she begins to backfill her defense. She calls the servants in, and she calls them the Hebrew, is mocking us. She tries to incorporate into her story the idea that she's with the servants and they're grouped together. The husband comes home, as Potiphar comes home. She then explains it to him in a different way, and then saying, the Hebrew servant mocked me. And so what you see is her differentiating between he's just a servant and look what he tried to do with me, and that I lifted up my voice and cried, and so he had to run away and left his garment. And in verse 19, we find that Potiphar's wrath is kindled. Now, I always assumed that this meant that he was upset at Joseph, but I've come to realize recently that I think he was upset at his wife. This was probably not her first indiscretion, and that Potiphar really liked Joseph, and that he knew he was innocent. And remember, the thinking of the Egyptian people at this time was murder, not so bad, taking someone else's wife, very bad. If he really didn't believe Joseph, him being a slave, he would just simply have executed him. But instead, he has him taken to prison. So in my mind, Potiphar is saying, I don't really believe my wife. I'm upset at her. But because of the political situation, he has to punish Joseph and sends him to prison. I did some searching around to see if there were other accounts given about Joseph, and I found it in the Koran in chapter 12 that there's a very interesting story that kind of fills in some of the gaps. In fact, it talks about Potiphar actually thinking about adopting Joseph as a son, and that when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, he runs out and she tears his garment. And then actually Potiphar is returning unexpectedly and Joseph runs into him in the hall, according to the Quran. And he talks to Potiphar. He explains his side of the story. She explains her side of the story. And then when Potiphar examines Joseph, he sees that the garment is torn in the back and not in the front. So obviously Joseph is telling the truth. He's trying to flee, and it wasn't an attack that was described by his wife. Then we find that the gossip mill begins to run amok among the ladies of the elite. And so Potiphar's wife holds a party and demonstrates to them who Joseph is and how beautiful he is, how handsome he is. And the women are just in awe. They were all peeling fruit at the time when this was happening. And they begin to cut themselves because they can't take their eyes off of Joseph. And then Joseph goes to Potiphar and says, for my own protection, can you please put me in prison? And so while the essentials of the story are the same, it's told in a different vein in the Quran. And so we have here the beginning of what I like to call the witness protection program, because Joseph asks to be taken away and to be hidden so that he can be protected. Joseph is put into the prison. Obviously, over time, the Lord continues to bless him. And in very short order, he becomes the overseer. In verse 22, Joseph Smith translation changes the wording here to say an overseer. So he's placed in charge of the entire prison. And the keeper of the prison doesn't really have to do anything, the guy in charge. He just lets Joseph handle everything. This is reminiscent of what we find in Romans 8, where it says, all things work together for good to them that love the Lord or love God. The Lord allows him to go through this frustration of being in prison, and yet he continues to bless him, to help him, to look after him. Then we move on to chapter 40, and this is the very famous story of Joseph interpreting the two dreams of the officers who are imprisoned with him. The first officer appears to be very sad one day, and Joseph talks to him about why he's so sad, and he says he has dreamed a dream. And he asks Joseph if he can interpret the dream, and Joseph replies, do not interpretations belong to God, but tell them, I pray. So he asks him to tell him the story. And this is a very famous story. He was the butler for the Pharaoh, and he tells of the story of the grapes and the wine and the three branches. And then Joseph explains the vision to him as in 3 days the Pharaoh will restore him in place, and that he'll be the butler to the Pharaoh again. And then when he says this, when he interprets the dream, he says, remember me when you go back and you're before Pharaoh, and that I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, that I haven't really done anything wrong, but here I find myself in prison. And then there's the other officer who's imprisoned, who's the baker, and he tells his story, and Joseph interprets it for him with not a happy ending, that in 3 days Pharaoh will have his head cut off. And then verse 23 is interesting. The chief butler is restored, but he forgets about Joseph. From the Old Testament Institute Manual, we have the following. Joseph is in prison for a further 2 years after he interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker. He was sold into slavery when he was about 17, and he's 30 years old when he becomes the vice regent. And altogether, he served 13 years with Potiphar and in prison. The record does not tell how long he served Potiphar, but that he worked his way up to be the overseer of the prison implies that some period of time before the butler and the baker joined him. So it's likely that Joseph was in prison at least 3 years and quite possibly longer. So in chapter 41, Pharaoh dreams a dream, and the magicians and the wise men of Egypt are not able to assist him in interpreting the dream. But then the chief butler, who's been restored to service with Pharaoh, remembers at last about his friend Joseph, who's in prison. And he tells Pharaoh the story about himself and the baker and how the interpretation came true. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and they bring him quickly out of the dungeon. They bathe him and shave him and change his clothes, and he comes in to visit the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've dreamed a dream. There's none that can interpret it. Canst thou interpret the dream for me? And it's very telling here that Joseph says, saying, it's not really me. It's God who can give you this answer of what the dream means. And so Pharaoh begins to explain to him the dream about the cattle. This is very famous, so I'm not going to go through it. He also explains to him about the corn. And Joseph says to Pharaoh that these two dreams are really the one dream, or there's one interpretation of them. And the reason that the Lord gave it to him twice is because he's trying to God's establishing the truth of it to Pharaoh, so that Pharaoh will understand and believe. And in verse 33, Joseph explains to the Pharaoh that there's going to be famine and that he needs to prepare for it, and that Pharaoh needs to find a discreet man and a wise man and set him as the head over the land of Egypt and to begin this food storage program in order to save the country. Then Pharaoh says, can we find such one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is, that God has showed him all these things? And from Elder Bednar, we have revelations are conveyed in a variety of ways, including, for example, dreams, visions, conversations with heavenly messengers, and inspiration. And so Pharaoh recognizes that Joseph is a man of God and that he has this Spirit of God in him. And so in verse 40, he appoints him. He says, thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And so he appoints him as this man who needs to begin the food storage program. And so he exalts him to this status of second in the kingdom. And then he also gives to him a wife who was the daughter of the priest of On. Now, some people have questioned why, after all this time, where everyone's being very, very careful that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their forefathers, are all married into the covenant line, why would then he, Joseph, be given a wife from the priests of On, who obviously didn't believe in Jesus Christ, didn't believe in the things that Joseph believed? It's very interesting because even though there's only passing mention in the Old Testament about Asenath, this wife that he's given by the Pharaoh, there is a lot written in some of the exterior text. In particular, the Armenian canon, which is a Greek translation, have a lot of stories about her, about his wife, that she was as beautiful as Joseph was handsome, and that she actually didn't like men. She hated men because they were always throwing themselves at her because she was so beautiful. And that when Joseph's touring the area, collecting food during these 7 years of plenty, that he comes upon the area where the priest of On is set up, and Asenath's father kind of sets up this casual encounter between Joseph and his daughter. And this is all recorded in this ancient Greek document. Now, Joseph hates women just as much as Asenath hates men for the very same reason, because they're always trying to seduce him. And so when he sees her, he asks the priest to send her away. But when Asenath sees Joseph, according to this document, and I've included here the story that's in the encyclopedia, and then also a translation into English of this story, this exterior story. And when Asenath sees Joseph, she's cut to the quick. Her stomach turned over, her knees become limp, her whole body trembles, and she's much afraid and cries out and says, "Where shall I go, and where can I hide myself from him? And how will Joseph, the son of God, regard me, for I have spoken evil of him? Where can I flee and hide myself? For he sees everything, and no secret is safe with him because of the great light that is in him." And so she's totally smitten with Joseph, and she realizes that she's really judged him wrongly, and that he is this righteous and gorgeous, handsome man. This almost reads like a novel when you're reading through it. And I've read through the whole thing. It was quite interesting. So anyway, Joseph is kind of really is staying away from her, doesn't really want to have anything to do with her, and she's totally smitten with him. Her father, the priest of On, requests that he stay the night, and Joseph says, no, he's got too many things to do. He'll be back in 8 days. Asenath is so smitten and so distraught from after seeing Joseph that she doesn't eat for a week. And she throws away all her gold, her silver, all her precious things out the window. She doesn't eat. And then she's visited by an angel, according to this story. And the angel talks to her and helps her in a process where she's converted unto Joseph's God. So that when Joseph comes back in the 8th day, she has completely turned around, and then starts this love story where they fall in love and then they are married. And as previously indicated, they have 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh. And that really kind of starts to set up where we're going to go with this story. And then the last slide I have for you is that when the famine begins, everybody has to come to Egypt for food because no one else has food with this drought of 7 years. Eventually, everybody has to come to Egypt to Joseph to buy food. And of course, that sets up what happens in our story for next week, when the brothers who sold them into Egypt, into slavery, have to come and request food from him. So I hope you've enjoyed what we've talked about today. We're going to go a little deeper into some of these aspects on Thursday night. So join us for that if you can, and have a great week reading about Joseph.